The rancher's twins sewed the governess's dress to the quilt, so she couldn't pack. The thread was blue. That's the part nobody ever believes when I tell it, that my daughters, 8 years old and supposedly asleep, had gone into Miss Aldine Prute's room with a spool of my dead wife's mending thread and stitched the hem of her good gray traveling dress to the wedding ring quilt at the foot of the bed. 8 stitches. Even. Deliberate. Like they'd planned it for a week. Which I would come to find out they had. I need to back up some. I'm not a man given to long stories. Ask anyone in Creston County who knows me, Holt Kessick, the Dunmore Ranch, 400 head of Herefords and a spread that goes from the creek line to the base of the first ridge, and they'll tell you I say what needs saying and leave the rest alone. Ellen used to laugh at me for it, said I could go 3 days without talking and not miss it. She wasn't wrong. Ellen died in the spring of 1887, 2 weeks before the twins turned 6, fever, fast as a candle going out. I won't talk about those first months because there's nothing to say about them that adds anything to anyone's life. I kept the ranch running. I got up before light and I went to bed after dark, and I didn't think about much except what needed doing next. The girls, Clara and Rose, I did my best. I fed them, I kept them warm, I answered their questions as straight as I could. But I was not a man who knew how to raise girls, and I knew it. And every morning when I looked at them across the breakfast table, I felt the full weight of everything I didn't know how to give them. We had a succession of women helping through the first year. An older woman from town who lasted 4 months before her own health gave out. A young girl from the Haverson place who was kind but barely older than a child herself. A stout, efficient woman named Mrs. Corder who ran the house like a military campaign and made the girls cry twice a week. I let each of them go, or they went on their own, and after Mrs. Corder I sat down one evening at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, and I looked at the lamp flame a long while and thought, I am going to ruin these children. That's not self-pity. That's just what I thought. A man alone on a cattle ranch, no softness in him, no particular gift for comfort or conversation. It was a plain appraisal of the situation, same as you'd appraise a fence line or a water table. A friend of mine, Garrett Foss over in Telluride, had hired a governess for his 3 children the year before, through an agency in Denver. He'd written well of her, said she'd steadied his household and his children had stopped biting each other. I wrote to the same agency. I told them what I had. A working ranch, no frills, 2 girls who needed someone who could teach them to read properly and talk to them like they mattered, and maybe, if she had the patience, show them how to be the kind of women their mother would have made them. I didn't expect much back. Miss Aldine Prute arrived on the 3rd of October, 1888, on the afternoon stage from Durango. I remember the first look I got at her. She was the last one off the stage and she was carrying 2 bags herself, hadn't waited for anyone to hand them down. A woman of maybe 30, dark hair pinned up tight, a plain brown coat. Not tall. She looked at the town, then at the mountains, then at me standing by the wagon, and her face didn't change much. Just took it all in like she was reading a page. I introduced myself. She shook my hand, a real handshake, not the fingertips kind, and said she was glad to be out of the city. That was about all we said on the 2-hour drive to the ranch. I asked a few questions about her background. She answered them clearly. She asked a few about the girls. I answered as best I could. What I remember most from that ride is that she didn't fill the silence. Most people do, they talk to cover it, get uncomfortable when it stretches. Miss Prute sat beside me on the wagon seat and watched the country go by like she had her own thoughts worth keeping company with. I found that I didn't mind the quiet with her in it the way I usually don't mind it alone. The girls were on the porch when we pulled up. Clara with her arms crossed, already measuring. Rose with her hands clasped in front of her, hopeful and a little scared. Miss Prute climbed down from the wagon, walked straight up to them, crouched to their level and said, I'm Aldine. You must be Clara and Rose. Your father wrote that you need someone to teach you. I'd like to know what you think you need to learn. Clara uncrossed her arms. That was October. By November, I had stopped thinking of her as the governess and started thinking of her simply as Aldine, though I never said it out loud. She ran the schoolroom in the mornings. In the afternoons, she let the girls help with whatever they wanted, the kitchen garden, the horses, a sewing project they'd started that I never fully understood the purpose of. She ate dinner with us most evenings. She didn't talk much during the meal, but when she did talk, it was worth hearing. Something she'd read, or a question for the girls that would get them going for 20 minutes, or once in a while, a dry observation about something she'd seen that day that made me nearly choke on my coffee. She was not soft. That's the thing I kept noticing. She had a particular way of looking at you when she thought you'd said something foolish, not unkind, just level, that reminded me a little of the look a good horse gives you when you're asking it to do something that doesn't make sense. She never talked down to the girls, and she never talked up to me, which I respected more than I could have explained to anyone. I started coming in from the range, a little earlier than I needed to. I told myself it was because I was keeping an eye on how things were going with the girls. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough to keep me from thinking too hard about the rest of it. What I noticed those evenings, the sound of the house had changed. It had gone from a house where sound was just noise, boots on boards, a door, wind in the chimney, to a house where the sound meant something. Clara reading aloud to Rose. Rose asking Aldine a question about something she'd seen in the sky. Aldine's voice answering, measured, certain, not talking down to an 8-year-old, but not pretending she was older than she was either. The smell of supper actually being supper and not just boiled necessity. Little things. Things that don't make it into a cattle ledger or a tally book. I started staying in the kitchen after dinner, working at the table, accounts, letters to buyers, instead of taking everything to the office, just to be in the same room. It took me 3 weeks to admit to myself why. When I did admit it, I also admitted it was hopeless. A governess doesn't come to a cold ranch in the Rockies to take up with the widower. She comes to do a job, and eventually she goes. She was educated, composed, had opinions about things I'd never once thought about. I was a rancher who smelled like cattle most of the time and read only what the business required, and had gone mute with grief for the better part of 2 years. There was nothing there to warrant it. I set it aside, kept my distance. Stayed polite, professional, and careful. The girls apparently had other ideas. I don't know when they started scheming. Looking back, I can trace some of it. The way Clara started asking questions at dinner that seemed designed to get me and Aldine talking. The way Rose would disappear at convenient moments and reappear when things had gone quiet. But children are harder to read than cattle, and I was not paying the right kind of attention. The contract Aldine had come on was for 3 months, renewable. We were 2 weeks from the end of November when she told me, after dinner one evening, that she'd been offered another position, a family in Colorado Springs, starting in January. Better pay, closer to Denver, a newer house. She was considering it seriously. She said this matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, but she looked at the window while she said it instead of at me. I said that was a fine opportunity, and she should do whatever served her best, because that was the right thing to say. She went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the lamp flame for a long time. I told myself it's better this way. Clean, she goes, you find someone else, the girls adjust. They're young, they'll adjust. You'll adjust. You've adjusted to worse. I believed about half of it. 3 days later, she told me she would be leaving the 22nd of December, which gave us all time to make arrangements before Christmas. She'd already written to accept the position in Colorado Springs. I nodded and said that was fine. The girls went quiet for 2 days in a way that worried me, not weepy, not acting up, just quiet, which on Clara and Rose meant they were thinking hard about something. I asked Clara if she was all right. She said yes, sir, and looked at me with her mother's eyes, and I let it go. The 22nd came in cold and clear. which is the worst kind of day for a departure because there's nothing in the weather to blame. I'd had Hector Raines, my lead hand, bring the wagon around for 8 o'clock. Aldine had her bags packed and her coat on by 7:30. She came into the kitchen, said goodbye to the twins with hugs that lasted longer than I expected. She wasn't generally given to a lot of touching. And then she straightened and looked at me and said she was grateful for the position and that Clara and Rose were exceptional children, and she was confident they'd do well. I shook her hand and said she'd been good for them, and I meant it, and then I went to check on the wagon. I was outside maybe 5 minutes. I heard Clara's voice first, pitched high, which meant something was wrong, and then Rose's, and then a long pause, and then a sound I'd never once heard in 14 months from the room at the end of the hall. Aldine Prout laughing. Not a polite sound, a real one, the kind that starts somewhere low and gets away from you. I went back in. I stood in the doorway of her room. The trunk was open. The gray traveling dress was laid out on the bed, and stitched to the hem of it, running all the way along and looped twice around the brass knob of the footboard through the quilt, was a length of blue mending thread, tight and deliberate, and I could see from across the room, done with care. 8 stitches. Aldine was standing with her hand over her mouth, tears at the corners of her eyes, still making that sound. Clara and Rose were standing side by side at the foot of the bed, perfectly still, watching her like they were waiting on a verdict. Rose said, "We didn't want you to go." Clara said to me, without looking away from Aldine, "Papa didn't want her to go either. He just didn't say it." I am not a man who gets caught out easily. I've faced down angry buyers, bad weather, a horse that nearly took my head off outside of Montrose in '84. But I stood in that doorway with my hat in my hand, and I had nothing. Nothing at all. Aldine looked at me. I said, "Clara's not wrong. She missed the wagon." Hector waited 20 minutes before I went out and told him to put the horses up. He looked at me, looked at the house, and said, "Yes, sir," in a way that suggested he'd had his own opinion about things for some time. We didn't talk much that morning. Aldine unpacked her trunk. I sent the girls out to the barn on some invented errand, and I stood in the kitchen and waited for her to come in because I thought she would, and she did. She said I had accepted that position in good faith. I said, "I know that." She said, "I'm not someone who can be kept by a pair of children with a needle and thread." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me a moment, then she said, "Then why are you still standing there?" And I told her, not everything, I don't do everything at once, but enough. That I'd been keeping distance because I didn't think it was fair to her. That I didn't know if I was the kind of man she'd want when she could see all of him plainly and not just the parts I showed at dinner. That I'd spent 2 years convinced I was past anything good coming back into this house, and I wasn't sure I knew how to be worth something to a woman the way I'd once been, and I was still less than half sure I was getting this right. She listened to all of it, didn't interrupt, didn't let me off the hook by nodding along. When I finished, she said, "You're the man who writes to a stranger in Denver because he thinks he's going to ruin his daughters. That's what you are." I didn't have an answer for that. She said, "I wrote back saying yes because of the letter, not the ranch, not the wages, the letter." I stood there with that. Then she said, "Write to Colorado Springs. I'll tell them I've changed my situation." We were married in March. I want to say something here to the man who's listening, because maybe you know this feeling and maybe you don't, but I think some of you do. There's a point a man reaches, not old, not finished, but past the first flush of everything, where he starts to wonder if the best of his life is already behind him and what's left is just the maintenance. Keeping things running, not falling apart. I'd been at that point for a long time, not bitter about it. Just settled into the understanding that that was the shape of things now. What I did not account for was a woman looking at me, the way Aldine looked at me, and not looking away. Not because I'd done something heroic, Not because I'd swept her off her feet with some grand gesture. She looked at me because she'd seen the full plane of me, the silences, the hard edges, the fact that I communicate better with horses than with most people, the grief I was still carrying under everything, the stubbornness, all of it, and she had decided it was enough. More than enough. She'd said as much in her plain way on the morning after the dress stitching, and she'd meant it in the way Aldine Prute meant everything, precisely and without revision. A man doesn't know what that does to him until someone does it. I don't have words big enough for it. What I have is the memory of standing in that kitchen in March in my good shirt, while the girls arranged wildflowers in a jar for the table, and Aldine coming in from the other room with her hair down for the second time I'd ever seen it, and looking at me the way she'd gotten in the habit of looking at me, like I was the answer to a question she'd been working on for a while, and me thinking I was wrong about the shape of things. The twins turned 9 that spring. I had long conversations with them both, separately, which is how you have to do it with Clara and Rose or they perform for each other, about the stitching, about honesty and about doing things straight instead of sideways. Clara listened carefully and told me she understood and that she would not do it again unless it was necessary. I told her that wasn't quite what I was going for. She looked at me with those eyes and said, "But it worked, Papa." I told her that was not the point. It was a little bit the point. Rose just cried and hugged me and said she was sorry and that she loved Miss Aldine, and I told her Miss Aldine was going to be her mother soon, and she cried harder but in a different way, and that was that. I've been trying to think about why I'm telling this story. I don't usually tell it, not the full version. A few people know pieces. Hector knows more than most because he sees everything that happens on this ranch and has the good sense not to comment on most of it. Maybe it's just that I'm at an age now where the things I almost let go of look different to me than they used to. I almost let Aldine Prute get on that wagon. I almost said, when she told me about Colorado Springs, something real instead of "that's a fine opportunity." And I didn't. And if 2 8-year-old girls with a spool of blue thread hadn't intervened, I'd be sitting in this kitchen alone right now, and I'd be telling myself it was fine. It wasn't fine. I just thought fine was what was left for me. I was wrong about that. There's a particular time in the evenings now, after supper, when the girls are doing their lessons at the kitchen table, and I'm working the accounts, and Aldine is in the chair by the stove with whatever she's reading, and it gets quiet in a way that's different from every other kind of quiet I've known. Warm in a way the house wasn't warm before. She looks up sometimes and catches me looking, and she doesn't make a thing of it. Just gives me that look level, certain, like she knows something and goes back to her book. I go back to the accounts. The lamp burns down. Outside the window the mountains are dark against the sky, same as they've always been. Same as they'll be long after we're gone. But inside this kitchen, right now, is a thing I didn't think was coming for me anymore. I'm not a man who uses many words for it. But I know what it is. The blue thread is still on the quilt. Aldine sewed over it when she repaired the hem, neat small stitches, her own, right over the twins' crooked ones. She didn't have to do that. She could have cut it out clean. She left it there on purpose. That's the kind of woman she is.